This is a second generation Honda Jazz, and yes, from the thousands of cars that we're lucky enough to experience, I would rate this as the most reliable car under £5,000. Now that's not to say that there's no problems with them, so do yourself a favour and watch this video if you're planning on buying. Let's go. So the second generation Jazz hit the scene in October of 2008 here in the UK, and at the time there was two pretty badass engines to choose from. Okay, so I might have lied, they weren't very badass, but they very much embodied the spirit of the Jazz, because both the 1.2 with 90 horsepower and the 1.4 with 100 horsepower were extremely reliable engines. Now Honda were quite savvy when they made the Jazz. This is something that a lot of manufacturers do, but not quite to the same extent. They made a very versatile platform with this second generation. So here in the UK, we might have got the 1.2 and the 1.4, but if you lived in Brazil, you got a 1.35 that was capable on running on the locally found biofuel with a lot of ethanol in it. And if you lived in India, for example, you got the ultra low emission 1.2, which fitted in with the super strict government guidelines. But Grant, you're talking about all this reliability and you said these cars still got problems, so what were the problems? Well, unfortunately, one of the problems that we tended to see on these engines fairly commonly was blown head gaskets, although it's not really the car's fault. Let me explain. So the problem is the Honda Jazz, and this is my main gripe with it, has no coolant gauge. So what happens is the driver's going along quite happily, they've sprung a coolant leak, which can happen, an aging radiator starts to leak or a hose clamp slips off, and all of a sudden you've got no coolant. The first you're going to know about it from this seating position is when the damage has likely already been done. So we want to be on the lookout for classic head gasket symptoms, and those head gasket symptoms that we speak of are excess smoke when the car starts up, hesitation when accelerating. I'll remind you of that when we get this out in a test drive, which I'm looking forward to because it's absolutely bloody freezing, and a lumpy idle. Of course, if you're buying a 2011 onwards second generation Jazz, you're going to get the facelift. Now that came with some revised looks, slightly lower emissions from both engines that we got here in the UK, but more significantly it also came with the option to get the Jazz in hybrid form. Now how reliable was the hybrid, you ask? Pretty reliable on whole. Now one thing you should be aware of is although Honda warranted the batteries for 5 years, we've seen them last up to 10, that's pretty common. What you should be aware of though is that any Jazz that you look at now that's 2011, 2012, that battery is probably coming to the end of its life. You're going to need to budget between £1,000 and £3,000 to get that replaced. Next up, don't forget this check. Turn the headlights on and get a look at how bright they are. They should be about as bright as any other non-xenon car that you've ever seen. Yeah, you can see these are pretty bright. Now there was a problem with the wiring harness for the headlights. Basically they would start to go dull over time. It was a recall from Honda, so I'm sure they will sort it out for you if you happen to have this problem, but it's still hassle. If they're looking a bit dull, bring that into the negotiation. Try and save yourself a bit of money with the seller. Next up, an age-old problem with these Hondas, and yes, it is starting to snow, but we're still out here grafting. Bad car dealers don't take the day off, and neither do we. The problem is water ingress into this boot, so get this boot floor lifted, check for any evidence that water's been in there. Usually it's this seal on the second generations, although it can be a couple of things. I can send over a DIY guide if you want to have a go at fixing this yourself. Next problem is something quite specific, but if you're relying on this, the third passenger seatbelt in the back, make sure it clips in and stays seated correctly. In other words, make sure you can't pull it back out. There's a problem with the webbing switch inside it. Again, this was a recall, so Honda should put it right for you, but again, it's hassle, so make sure it's not the case on the one you're buying. Here's some real world stuff for you. You know, I put the headlights on to let you guys see the brightness of the headlights. Well, I've made a bit of a rookie error and the battery's flat. Okay, right, we're gonna get some jump leads. So I really wasn't joking. I'm having to walk through a field in the snow, feet are soaking. This is a turn of events that I didn't think I'd be adding to a buyer's guide, but there you go. Here we go. What's it saying? Oh, full. Look at the size of the battery. The booster pack's bigger, no wonder it died. Come on, please work, baby, come on. Yes! on with the buyer's guide we go. Hey, hey. So next, let's talk rust. Unfortunately, that's what put most of the first generation Jazzies into the scrapyards where they find themselves today. Now the second generation, although a little better, as it ages, inevitably that rust is going to start appearing. Now the places you want to check carefully are the sills. Get your hand under, make sure nothing's crumbling, around the rear wheel arches, and also the suspension top mounts under the bonnet. Check those three areas and just have a good general look over the car as well. Anything significant and it's worth just walking away. There's plenty out there that are pretty rust free. Next up, let's get on to gearboxes, because there was some big changes to them from the first generation and also some potential big problems. But before we get to that, a quick favour to ask of you guys. If you're getting value from this, please do hit the like button, and we create these buyer's guides for every type of car, so it may be a worthwhile subscribe for you as well. So let's talk gearbox. First up, you had the manual. Now this was significantly better, I'm happy to say, than the first generation of Jazzies, which suffered an awful lot of input shaft bearing failures. Now that's not to say that these can't have the same problem, particularly some of the early 2008 second generation Jazzies. Now there are symptoms to look out for. Listen out for a distinct noise that you'll hear when the car's turned on and sat in neutral. That noise will disappear when you put your foot on the clutch. Also, listen out for any whining in any of the gears on that test drive. Now the second option you had was this. So what is this, I hear you ask? Well, this is the trendily named I-Shift gearbox, which is ironic because you are in fact not shifting gear at all. It's an automated manual gearbox, and what I mean by that is there's a little delay in between the gear changes, just like there would be if I was manually pushing the clutch in and changing gear. It's pretty good, and in terms of the speed of it, honestly, I would say it's about as fast as my old Ferrari 360 at actually changing gear. Now that is a little older, probably 10 years older than this car, but still, I think that's quite the testament that your Honda Jazz city car changes gear just as quick as a Ferrari from yesteryear. So you probably know what's coming next. Unfortunately, there were a couple problems to be aware of with this gearbox. First off was moving it from neutral into drive. It wouldn't always go into gear. Now the problem, more often than not, was a faulty brake switch. Now that might seem a bit strange, but if you think about it, what the car does is it needs to detect the brake as being pressed before it will go into gear. If it can't detect that, it won't go into gear. So in fact, quite a simple fix. Don't worry too much if the car that you're driving does that on the test drive, because it's probably just that brake switch. So I'm really trying hard here to give you guys as much consumer buying advice as possible. I'm trying to hit the points that appeal to everyone, the sort of stuff that the masses are going to be using a Jazz for. Here's a point actually, if you happen to have a 55 or 60 kilo Rottweiler, he fits in the back quite comfortably. Now sticking with this theme of gearbox problems, here's one for you, and that is as you go to pull away, make sure there's no gearbox judder. This is something that was seen in the first generation CVT gearboxes, and it's quite similar in this, wherein a fluid change 99% of the time will take away that judder. However, you are still taking that risk, aren't you? Because if a fluid change doesn't solve it, then you're into replacing components in that gearbox and clutch setup, and that is not going to be cheap. So either way, make sure you get a significant amount of money off to cover whatever the problem is there. You alright, Enzo? Now the next issue, and this one's important for obvious reasons, but the electric windows could sometimes have problems, and that's just not good enough, I'm afraid.
Hi there, what can I get for you?
Hiya, can I just get a plain McFlurry, please? So the big question is, how does the Jazz score on a reliability leaderboard? Well, to be quite honest with you, the Jazz remains an absolute benchmark of reliability. You'll notice pretty much every problem I've mentioned in this guide is fairly trivial and you can put it right with hardly any cost. And it's for that reason we score the Jazz an absolutely massive 9.5 out of 10. I don't think I'm going to get much of this McFlurry, but thank you for watching. Please do hit subscribe, like, and we'll see you for the next video. conclusion to the video, returning to get the CRV, because obviously we had to take the Jazz and finish filming. For one, it is sheet ice. It's about -3, pitch black, but I've got my guard dog. Thanks for watching, please do subscribe, see you next time.